Hello and welcome to another episode of the Monday Book Club. This week we're having a bit of change of style because we're going to keep a dandy handy. It's the 80th anniversary issue and we're going to take a look. It's long been a staple of British culture, and when it went digital only a few years ago, it felt like a part of my childhood had died. So when I spotted a copy of the dandy back on the shelves of my local W.H. Smith, I did a double take. Was that really the latest issue of the comic back in print form? No, sadly it was not. Instead, it's a collection marking the 80th anniversary of Britain's oldest comic. Today on the Monday Book Club, we're taking a break from discussing books to talk about this landmark in comic history. The dandy turns 80 and returns to print for a party. Let's join it. First of all, we need to discuss the cover. That there, carrying his trademark cow pie, is Desperate Dan, but regular readers of the digital comic might find he looks a bit different. That's not Dan as he looks these days. It's his old style, last seen in the 90s when the old DC Thompson house art style was still in force. Notice the shading on both Dan and the pie? Now check out the art style and lack of shading on the other characters on the cover. It's totally different. Dan is Dan from the past, breaking through the barrier between print and digital to let the new style out to play. It certainly makes for an eye-catching cover. The inside covers, back and front, contain a selection of images from the comic's past, which is very much in keeping with how the covers of the old, and it's hard to believe that that's an accurate description these days. 50 Golden Years anniversary book was lined too. It's very interesting to see the progression of not only the art style of the decades, but also how much storytelling in the comic has changed. Layout, storytelling, dialogue and art have all evolved to the point where the older comics are unrecognizable compared to the new ones. Some of the characters I remember, but others I have no clue about, sometimes because they are from before my time, and others are from after. If there's one thing I would criticize about these clips, it's the reproduction quality. I don't know whether it's because they used lower resolution scans or had to digitally repair some of their archive, but the images are, as a rule, rather low resolution. This leaves the images blurred, and it would have been nice to get a proper, sharp, high-resolution image, but oh well. The print trouble continues throughout the collection, with only the newer and obviously digital art comics being printed in sharp quality. As a comparison, here's the first page of the first episode of Judge Dredd from 2000 AD, issue 2. This was originally printed in 1977 when the dandy was 40 and is collected here in Judge Dredd The Complete Case Files No. 1. It's sharp, it's high contrast, and it's lovely. That's archive reproduction done properly. But back to the dandy. Inside we get 66 pages, which I think is a missed trick here. Why not 80 pages, giving us a one-page strip from each year of the comic's run? Where 14 of these pages are covers from comics, specials or annuals from over the years, and 49 are actual comics. The other 3 are adverts. The covers are a lovely reminder of the past and, like the clips on the inside covers, show how much the comic has changed over the years. With each of the comic titles that's included in this anthology, we see some episodes from early in the character's career and then some from later. It gives us a nice selection of the character over a wide period, and that's really nice. So let's get to the meat of the matter. What's the selection of comics like? Well, we get a nice sample from across 8 decades, with newer stuff intermeshed with the old. The comics begin with one of the early Desperate Dan strips, drawn by the original artist Dudley D. Watkins, before moving on to a comic that I actually remember from back when I read the dandy, the 17th of November 1984 issue, where Dan made it to the front cover. The Dandy and the Beano used to run comics on their front covers, and continued this trend well into the 90s, possibly beyond. These days the covers are usually just one-off images, but back in the classic era, they were used to house extra strips. Personally, I preferred it that way, but oh well, times change. This time with the 80s strip, he's drawn by newer Dan artist Ken Harrison, whose rendition of the character I personally prefer, having grown up with it. I'm certainly not a fan of the blocky rendition the new artist Jamie Smart uses. It just doesn't fit well with me, but he does write some funny scripts though, so that's pretty good. Next up we have Corky the Cat, the original cover star for the comic. He lasted on the cover for 50 years, which is amazing in and of itself. Whether it's original artist James Crichton, his successor Charles Grigg, Robert Nixon, who was the artist I remember from the 80s, or the latest artist Chris McGee, Corky the Cat still amuses. The comics are as funny now as when he first arrived on the page. He's also fared far better in the art department than Desperate Dan did, with a really lovely art style for his 2000s makeover. After that, we have Keyhole Kate. This is a one-note character that I never got on with back when I read the comic, and to be honest, the comics are still one-note now. Kate is obsessed with keyholes, especially peeping through them. She's either getting into scrapes because of her privacy-invading behaviour, or obsessing over keyholes in some manner. That's the sum total of the comic. Passable art though, so there's that. Winker Watson follows, and I have to be honest, I don't remember this character at all. Apparently he hung on into the 80s, but he doesn't ring a bell for me. Based on these strips, however, it's like a dandy variant on the Bash Street Kids, only with a Roger the Dodger character playing the part of all the kids. It's a decent comic with some wonderful art, relying less on jokes and more on situational comedy and hijinks. Next we have what has to be the weakest of the titles in this collection, Jack Silver. This was an adventure serial that ran from 1973 to sometime in the 80s, which makes it all the more bizarre that the only reason I remember this character at all is because he's in the 50 Golden Years collection. The art is decent, if somewhat archaic at times, but the stories utterly fail to grip me. Perhaps it worked at the time, but given that I was reading the dandy at what must have been the end of his strip's run, I doubt it was all that enthusing even back then, because I simply do not remember it. So what's next? Oh my goodness, how they grow. Beginning in 1970 as the fantastically illustrated Dynamite, comic readers got to know her better when she reappeared in the 80s as Dynamo, a slightly older incarnation this time round. She was always one of my favourite characters from the dandy, as she's essentially the dandy's gender-swapped version of the Beano's mascot Dennis the Menace. No, not that one. Dinah is a menace to society, always looking for ways to create trouble. The art is wonderful, and the stories are fast-paced ventures into Beano territory, which is great because the Beano was always pushing more boundaries than its more mature sibling, the Dandy. Definitely a winner with this selection then. Cuddles and Dimples follows. As with Dynamo, they are vile and unruly kids who want nothing more than to cause trouble. The problem is, the writing isn't as good, so they just come across as callous. This was never one of my preferred strips, and it hasn't got any better with age. Let's move on. After them, we have more tearaways, this time in the form of Jack. He's a character who debuted in 1997, a few years after I stopped reading. He started with an art style that is taken wholesale from Calvin and Hobbes, although it veers quickly into simple flash animation territory, and an attitude like a toned-down Dennis the Menace. I actually quite like this one. It's got a lot of character to it, and it's fun. And that's it. That's your lot from the comics. After that little lot, it's just a parade of old covers. Some of these are very interesting because they feature characters who didn't make it into the majority of the Looking Back anthologies. Characters like Smarty Grandpa and Freddy the Fearless Fly are pretty much lost to history unless you're prepared to scour old archives or find the issues online. So it was nice to see them represented here on some of the covers, even if we don't get to see what their stories were like. All in all, this 80th anniversary special is quite a treat if you enjoy the dandy or read it as a kid. It's a nice little package of nostalgia, and while the reproduction of the pages leaves a lot to be desired, because it seems they have basically photocopied old copies of the comics from the DC Thompson archives, and I do mean literally, there's a ripped section on one of the covers of the Dandy Summer specials where you can actually see the comic on the next page underneath. The stories themselves are good. Give it a read if you get the chance, and you'll no doubt find something to enjoy about it. Okay, there you are. That's the 80th anniversary issue of the Dandy, and I think actually it was pretty good. So if you have a chance to take a look, give it a try, because you never know, you might find something you like. Okay, that's all we've got time for this week, so thank you very much for watching. I hope you did like this, and if you did, remember to click the like button, share it with your friends so that they'll know a good book when they see it, and do subscribe for future videos because there will be more in the future. But until next time, I've been Zoe Kirk-Robinson, you've been watching the Monday Book Club on ZJKR, and I'll see you later.